From our position on the stage, it looks like the whole room's going to tip that way. Everybody's sitting on that side. If anybody feels that the aesthetic sense in them requires more balance and they'd like to move that way, now's a good time to do it.
Well done! Yay!
Thank you.
Right in the middle.
For architectural balance.
Yeah. Couldn't go without that. In case there's people out there who design buildings or build bridges or whatever. No mai haere mai, ko Simon Wilson, taku ingoa. Welcome to the panel discussion, AKL Now Next, inspired by the exhibition Civilisation, Photography Now. Thank you to the gallery for inviting us to speak with you and to you all for coming. I've been following the election for weeks. It feels like decades. But who needs politics when there's art, eh? The themes of the Civilisation Photography Now exhibition are hive, alone together, flow, persuasion, control, rupture, escape, and next. I like that sequence. It feels like there's a sense of history rushing past, and also a sense of crisis. The show, I should use this. I'll use this. I'll use this. Okay. The show predates COVID, but it feels like it captures the world on the edge of something. Is that something we can just say in hindsight? There are themes, the enormity of personal crisis and the great drift of populations. Both of those are part of history, they've always been with us. There are other themes, the formidable power of technology and design, our expertise that we know could be used to solve crises and keep us safe and allow us to prosper, but instead, over and over in the show, we see how it's created a world so complex, where everything is so interdependent on everything else, and where those who control the means of production and exchange, that's the land and the technology, are part of the problem, even as they do their best to convince us their interests are the same as ours, and they will be our salvation. We know now that the resources of the world are finite and we are destroying them. We also know that if we do not keep the economy growing, the result is loss of jobs and of livelihood and hope. What we don't know is what to do about that contradiction. What's the balance? How do we strike it? In this photography show, there is disappointment and pain and fear and horror. Those are not new things in our world. There may not be more of them now than there used to be, but we do know more about them. And in the show there is also hope, achievement, kindness, community, artistry, life. The works in the show almost suggest the worse things are, the more we assert what's valuable. Or is that a sentimental middle class idea, just something we reassure ourselves with? I don't know. Those photographs show us the worsening of the world, and yet they also ask for our hope. The better they are at showing the horror, the more they suggest we'll survive, perhaps even prosper. And is that because they're art? I don't know. And so here we are in Auckland, AKL, Now Next. Most of the exhibition is alien to Auckland, the scale, the pressure, the immediacy of the crisis and its apparent irreversibility too. Yet most of it is also recognisable. There's nothing in that show, the reality and the hopes and the fears it generates, that is not also in our city, now, or in a suddenly very foreseeable future. Crisis and opportunity. Is that another comforting slogan? We'd like to say we have the chance to build back better now. It's true, we do, but will we take it? Let me give you one example of how great the opportunity is and how hard it is for us to see it, let alone do the right thing if or when we do. As you all know, a truck blew over on the harbour bridge not so long ago, and everyone said, "We need another harbour crossing." The truck was carrying an empty container, which is why the wind could toss it around. Now you think about that. A truck carrying an empty container is one of the most low-value economic activities you could possibly dream up, and yet it pretty much took out the city. The solution doesn't have to be horrendously expensive tunnels that will only produce more congestion on the city's roads. The solution could be get the trucks off the bridge. How? With a freight-focused railway line around the northwest, of course. We like to say we have the chance to build back better. It's true, we do. But will we take it? We have 3 speakers tonight. I have to tell you I'm extremely sorry to say that Lucy Tukua could not be with us. She's had a bereavement in the family. We will miss her. Our 3 speakers are Tim Robinson, who is a senior urban designer at Jazzmax, Caroline Hope, who is a process engineer at Becker, and Charles Walker, who is at AUT. He is the head of Huri Te Ao, the newly named School of Future Environment. We're going to hear from each of them, and they're going to show us some slides of work that they have selected from the exhibition and talk about them. After that, we're going to talk about what they talked about. I've got a few slides I want to ask them some questions about, and there will, of course, be time for questions from the floor. First up, Tim Robinson.
Kia ora tātou. Ko he maha ngā haerenga te waka, ko Blencathra te monga, ko Ganges te awa, ko Robin tuku tupuna, ko Tim Robinson tuku ingoa. Thank you for coming and listening tonight. I hope we can have a really interesting conversation. That was actually the first time I've said my papiha to a big public gathering, and it's actually a really nice thing to do. It's actually, we were just talking beforehand, and I was saying how my experience of growing up has actually been in many, many places, and so I'm really envious of, in a positive way, of the culture that we have in New Zealand, of immense connection to land that AKL Maori brings. And I just wanted to frame the beginning of my short conversation around that, because it's one of the things that really led me to choose this picture by Edward Batinsky. So I said I grew up in lots of places. I grew up in, was born in India. I lived in the flatlands of the Midlands of the UK for a while, and then had a lot of formative years around the mountains of Inverness Lake District before going to study in Newcastle. So I don't really know one place that I'm connected to, but I'm absolutely fascinated by the connection that exists between people and the landscapes they live in. So having seen all those different cultures and having seen how they express themselves, to me this photo now is really interesting because it kind of is such an abstraction, right, of people's relationship with landscape. It's a beautiful composition, right? It's just this extraordinary sort of thing that if you wanted to make a painting that expressed the different moving parts of our machinery, that creates the developed world that a lot of us live in, you almost couldn't do it better than this apparently real place, which looks utterly surreal in its setting. But also I'm fascinated by this picture because it sort of pulls apart the stuff that I deal with in day-to-day work. So this is kind of almost like a palette of all the parts that we know make up cities. It's got the infrastructure, it's got the housing, it's got food production, but it's handled in such a way that it's really pulled back to its kind of raw and crude elements. And we see stuff that we don't really see because we live around it and we're kind of blinded to it, and we're kind of just not aware of the stuff that keeps us going every day. Another little thought I had just looking at this as I was coming to remind myself of this today is, this is awfully like what my kids play on Minecraft. It's a kind of almost like a gamified, I'll just get resources from here and I'll just build them into this thing here and I'll connect them with this. And it's a kind of, it really is at one level a beautiful abstraction, but at another level it's almost like a cartoon of the stuff that keeps us alive, and we're teaching our kids this sort of slightly simplistic way of understanding the world that you just stick in and you just get what you want and put it together. But I'm absolutely fascinated by the art of Batinsky and people like Alan Berger. If you've seen his photographs in a book called Droscape and many other pieces that he's done, which they're about pulling apart this sort of modern world that we live in and showing some of the weirdness, and often they're from the aerial perspective, and so you see things in a way that we kind of tend to only see when we're travelling and we've maybe got our eyes open in a particularly unusual way. But within this, it also speaks to me a lot of kind of how we treat the land, because in a way there's no land to see there at first glance, but obviously it is a place, it's a real environment, but we don't kind of tend to inhabit places like this. It sort of has all the components, if we're honest, of the sort of land extraction economy that we in New Zealand are actually really good at. We take a bit of land, we put some infrastructure in, and we kind of then commodify it into real estate and food production. But that lack of relationship in this image really worries me. So, my sense of lack of knowing just where I've come from and rootedness is almost brought to extremes here. There's this sort of this placelessness where actually, where do these people work? What's there? What is this climate that they live in? Do they just hide from the sun all the time? Do they have an understanding of that piece of dirt that they live on, that sort of actually really important land that they live on? Weirdly, there's almost no sense of what the economy or the culture is here either, or the community. So it's kind of so abstract in so many ways. I find that interesting. It's a really brutal image, because at first glance it might be a nice composition, but the detail in it really, would you actually like to live in one of those houses? I know it's kind of a work in progress, but really an extraordinary sort of place. So as a piece of art, I find it, it's actually incredibly interesting and confronting in this. And I think, in a way, we need these pieces to remind us that in Auckland we've got this incredible natural landscape, right? But this stuff is really what underpins the colonial model, right? This is all the toolkit that we as Westerners, as Pākehā, we have to confess we sort of brought to the venture of taking land and packaging it and selling onto. So in Auckland we've got a distraction, we've got some extraordinary natural landscape, as most of New Zealand does, which kind of makes us forget that we've built it this way, that we've commodified housing, that we rely on all this transport stuff that kind of sprawls everywhere and ties it all together. On a slightly more positive note, in a way this is the part of urban design for me as a professional that I'm most interested in, because it's not the micro piece, it's the how does it all go together, what are the pieces that go into that place, and how do you actually bring them together to make meaningful communities, and how do you make a society and an economy which actually is interrelated and productive and not sort of pulled apart and broken into so many pieces, really. And just briefly, the firm I work with, Jasmax, in our manifesto we talk about a commitment to bicultural and sustainable design. And well, what does that mean? What does it mean to work in a collaborative, multidisciplinary way? Well, primarily, I'd like to think that the legacy I leave my kids and society is not this. It's almost the antithesis of this, because this is what happens by accident when we don't pay attention to sustainability and when we don't pay attention to the cultural relationship between people and the land they live on. So there's a fragility about this as well, isn't there? Which, it's very strongly man-made and it's dominating its landscape, but it's actually kind of on the edge. You can see it literally in the environment, but that sense that we all live with now, that there's a breakdown in the climate and lots of the natural environment, really is something which threatens the kind of artifices that we put together like this, really. But from one extreme to another, if we can go to...
Just before you move on, is everybody clear what they're looking at there? Is anybody not sure? Everybody knows? Here we go.
So from one extreme to another, I guess from that macro picture of shaping cities, this is perhaps where a lot of the conversation in Auckland is at the moment, right? We're a city that's really aware that we're maturing, and you might argue New York and cities like it are the zenith of city building and urban design. And a lot of our lifestyle, even if we're not urban fans, it's about a reaction to whether we like this or not. And the varieties of urban are not accidentally, they've got urban in the name, so suburban and ex-urban, which is really what that first photo was. They're all reactions to the city, because even if you don't like it, we all live in its sphere. So even if you live in Wellsford, you're part of that Auckland economy in some way. We kind of have this massive urban system in the world now. And the cliche, of course, that everybody's heard over and over again is this is the year of cities. Jeffrey West, who's a scientist with the Santa Fe Institute, actually calls it, there's various names on there for the different geological phases in the Earth. He calls this the Abanicene. It's really not just the Anthropocene, which is about us as humans dominating things, but in a way, he's bold enough to label it as the age of cities, because these are the peak, almost, creations of what our civilization is realising. His work's really interesting to me, and I thoroughly recommend going reading a book called Scale if you haven't before. It kind of blew my mind in lots of ways. He talks about and recognises the fact that a city is it's an overlay of networks. So you've got an infrastructure network, the very physical stuff that we kind of saw in that first photo, and then you've got a social network, which is clearly what we're looking at here, and it's kind of here is almost where a lot of our focus in New Zealand is at, because we're aware we've not built the best environments within our streets and spaces, and that's really because we're, to cut right through to it, we're a product of the car era, aren't we? But we see it all around us in Auckland. We step out the door right here, so Queen Street, Britomart, Wynyard, the waterfront, all of these projects that are really kind of totemic of Auckland over, I think, the last decade. They're really paying attention to me, the setting for where people live and where they play out their lives, and the idea that the city is a stage to live in. It's the highly refined end of all the pieces that we saw in that desert image from Bertinsky. And it matters because of where we live, and it matters because we can all share in those costs and we can all share in the benefits, and it enriches lots of things to do with our culture and society. And this image, I guess, starts to talk about a whole range for me of different aspects of living in a city. Diversity is kind of what the city's key is about, isn't it? It's about choice. If you get enough people together, there's a lot of interesting, different stuff happens. You can meet different people, you can buy different stuff, you can do all these different experiences. And in a way, to me, this is kind of, along with that early picture, the epitome of how we live today, to talk about sort of exhibition title. But we don't really, looking at this photo, kind of get a sense of much about what these people are about. There's a kind of a weird detachment, isn't there? Where do they live? What do they do? What do they know? Where do they go to in home? At night? Is it a good home they live in? What is their story, and how did they get to live here? And how do they get to this point in time? So the city is this crucible for bringing people together. It's about proximity and very much about the social network, even if, to all intents and purposes, it's the physical things that we tend to obsess on and see all the time. So just going back to Geoffrey West, his book's a fantastic manifesto, and he just talks about a couple of really fascinating things. If you weren't aware of it, there's an idea of the science of cities which is actually really recent. We haven't studied cities because we haven't had them for very long. And compared to all of the other sort of engineering and science disciplines, there's actually been relatively little questions asked about what makes a city work and what makes it tick and what can we measure about it, how does that work? And his book's a fascinating study. He's a biologist, in fact I think he's a theoretical physicist, but his work then comes out of a lot of collaboration with other scientists like biologists, and his most extraordinary stuff is around how the city is incredibly reflective of the mechanisms in biological systems. So this may not look like a natural system, but the way it works under the hood is actually very, very like all of the natural systems that we live in. It's fractal, that means it sort of has this incredible scaling thing, and it self-organises and fills in spaces, and it has what he calls invariant terminals, which are like the smallest little unit you find in it, and it has optimisation, which is about how it sort of builds and structures itself. So space filling is the cells of our bodies, it's equally the land use and the buildings and the houses that we live in. Invariant terminals is actually the people and the houses they occupy. And the optimisation is really a lot to do with structure. So if you know anything about biology, how blood flows from the heart and then out into each of the cells, it's actually quite an extraordinarily efficient sort of structure. And he talks about the analogies that are obvious with networks like roads and gas and water and pipes. The scary bit is these growth patterns are actually incredibly universal biologically, and they're incredibly universal within cities. So the way things scale, how efficient something is as it gets bigger, or how many petrol stations you get, or how much crime you get, or how many partners you can find in a bar. These things are all incredibly predictable depending on the city scale and population, which is quite extraordinary. So his overall thesis is actually a city works best when the physical stuff and the social stuff are absolutely matched up and optimised, because a city's role is to bring people together. And when those two infrastructures and the networks match and marry up, that's when you get a high-performing city, and that's when you get a place which really works for people and it works for the economy as well. When we build right, we can actually thrive. do recommend going and reading his book. It's not like bedtime reading, just a warning, but it's great stuff. And that takes kind of his final observations really around that sort of dynamic are really interesting because he then talks to sustainability, and this is a wonderful place. Many of you might have seen pictures of it. I've certainly visited a couple of times because Singapore is such a popular stopover place for anybody leaving New Zealand. My kids love it. This is really fun, right? This is a really interesting place. If you don't know it, it's in the gardens by the bay. These things are called super trees, and they're meant to be almost like a biomimicry sort of piece, which is a kind of a bit of human engineering, trying to teach people and educate people about the natural world and how we could be more sustainable and live more sustainably. But even though my kids loved it, I've got really great memories of this place to visit, the work of the photographer is really interesting because he effectively critiques this very crude understanding that you see in the first photo from Patinsky of how we put infrastructure together, but he also critiques our sort of understanding of how sophisticated our understanding of the natural world is and how we can start to work better with that. So, to cut to the chase with the Geoffrey West piece, he talks about these extraordinary patterns of scaling which apply to biology and they apply to cities. But he then draws out the two differences. So nature effectively scales in a way which is naturally stabilising. It naturally reaches a limit. So we can think of how we grow old, and we can think of how it naturally slows the pace of life as you get older. So you go through this incredible growth stage when you're a child, and then you go through middle age, and you kind of just everything slows down, and the biological systems basically just gently take you towards what we all know is inevitable. The difference with the city system is it's essentially completely the opposite. It amplifies returns and it amplifies growth, and it increases instability, and it accelerates the pace of life. So that old cliche about life is getting faster, that is a result of the urban machine. This is something that Geoffrey West will show you can measure, and you can see in all sorts of little expressions of urban life. You can see it in simple things like the bigger the city, the faster the people walk. The pace of life literally gets faster around population. And there's 101 different observations he brings to that. So his key observation is our problem with cities is exponential growth that cities produce cannot be infinite. It gets to this point where it's just not going to be able to mathematically, it's called a singularity. It simply cannot exist because you're trying to do infinite stuff in finite space and time. And so I guess this poses really important questions for future sustainability, and that's where he lands the book and closes it with very few clear answers, but with a real sense of we need to look at how this works and understand where those limits are baked into that system that we've created and how a natural system actually works in a self-stabilising, self-sustaining way. These things consume huge resources. How do we respond? Do we carry on just spending this kind of resource? Do we innovate? Do we find new ways to go forward? In JASNAX, we've been very clear on our environmental targets. We're now adopting policies around how much energy we want to see put into the making of a building, the building as it's operated, and the water it uses over its lifetime. But that's only one level of innovation. That's where we're at right now in society, right? We know we've got to lift the game on those sorts of things. The problem with innovation, according to Geoffrey West, is it's a one-off thing, and the pace of innovation consistently has to get faster. So if you look over history and the Industrial Revolution and the various, we're supposedly in the fourth stage now, we've all got to get faster and quicker, and the innovations have got to get better, and can we sustain that? So carbon is our current focus, but if we're all honest, we know we're not going hard enough on some of that stuff, and you see it played out in the political debate at the moment. We need to step up to a bigger set of considerations, in my view, back to Geoffrey West. Systems thinking, what is the big pattern, what is the big dynamic that's going on, and how do we head towards something that could be more like stable and bounded growth? So I'm going to pass on in just a moment, but for me, 3 photographs, they talk about civilization where we live now. There's one thing for certain, in any of us who work in design and planning and development, the future does not look like the past, and we shouldn't be trying to stick with what we know and we're safe with. And there's a lot in how we design cities and settlements, our socio-economic system, that we need to change, not just the detail, but the fundamentals of how we bring lots of it together.
Tim Robinson, thank you. Caroline Home.
Nō mai, haere mai, whakatau mai rā.
tēnei te mihi, kia koutou, kua tai mai nei, I tēnei rā. Ko te koa te maunga, ko hurunu I te awa, no waitaa aho. Ko Caroline toku ingoa. Kia ora everyone, my name is Caroline. I'm a process engineer at Becca. I work in the water and wastewater sector. So the area of the exhibition that really struck me was the flow section. I think it's because as an engineer we work with flows. And me specifically, I help with designing and building and maintaining water, which is one of our largest flows. So I've got a question for you all. Can you put your hand up if you have some sort of idea where your water comes from in Auckland? Okay, cool, great. And now can you put your hand up if you have some idea where your wastewater goes? Okay, cool. Well, so as my first year as a graduate, I was actually based out at Mangere Wastewater Treatment Plant. We were commissioning an upgrade, and my job every day was to put on some steel cap boots, high-vis, take a paddle and go and declog some blockages of sludge to make sure that your flow continues to be processed well and that your wastewater is clean and that the biosolids are separated.
Nice.
Very, very glamorous.
Good use of the word sludge.
Yeah, thank you. It is a technical term. It's, crazy. So I guess in general, engineers design, we construct and we maintain flows. And these are lots of everyday aspects of our lives could be considered flows, whether it's electricity, water, transport, travel. Of course, we've got the more abstract ones of ideas and carbon or whatever it might be. But the two images I've chosen today are to expose two kind of categories of flows. So we've got supply chains and infrastructure. So the first one is this one, also by Edward Batinsky. Incredible photographer. He did a massive mission around China to expose where China was at. This was around 2005, and this was one of the images he got. It was when he was on sort of manufacturing piece of his journey. So what this image makes me think about is, why are our flows invisible to us? Why do we not understand where things come from and where they go? And yes, it's awesome to see that you guys understand where the wastewater comes and where it goes from, but we don't really know who all those people are involved in getting that thing to us and who's involved with dealing it once we've left it. So it's all very linear process, I feel. I wonder, how would we treat our flows if we actually knew more about where they came from and where they went? I guess the education piece, but also if we had to pay maybe the true cost for these flows. So if we actually, thinking socially around fair wages, but also if we placed the true value on the environment and the carbon cost, what would our food cost, what would our electricity, what would our water cost? Would we treat it differently? I don't know. Imagine if we thanked all of the people that were involved with getting that flow to us. One guy actually did this. He wanted to thank everyone that was involved in making his coffee. So it took him, I think, a year or something. He got very specific. He was like, well, there's these scuba divers that have to get my coffee beans from... No, sorry. The scuba divers are taking the barnacles off the ship that get my coffee beans from XYZ to XYZ. And he went really to the minute detail, but a very interesting exercise itself. Another question that comes to mind is, how does technology reduce or improve the fragility of our flows? During COVID, we saw a lot of meat processing plants, particularly in America, shut down. They are very manual, there's a lot of workers involved, maybe similar to this context here, and that flow was actually, I guess, ruptured in America. But compared to in Denmark, where they're massive pig producers, pork producers, and those factories there are almost entirely robotic. There was no reduction in flow whatsoever. So yes, I guess technology can improve these flows, but how do we make sure that we're using technology to actually reduce our environmental impact rather than just promote or enable excessive consumption. Cool, I've got another, the regenerative farming aspect. Maybe I'll just quickly touch on this. So I think it is a real shame right now, if we think about all of the chickens, for example, processed here. For those of you who don't know, chickens are actually an incredible component of regenerative agriculture or permaculture farming. They offer a lot to the land, they can fertilise, they weed, they are great for pest control. They're really incredible assets to the land, yet when we farm them for such excessive consumption, they end up not adding that value to the land during their lifetime. So I just wonder, how do we bring that kind of circularity into the future of farming? Cool, thank you. Awesome, so this is an image of suburban California, incredible motorway. It's actually the same image, just duplicated. It oddly looks like a fish with like a little eye. It's weird, it's beautiful, but yet ugly. I don't know. I think as an engineer, you can kind of appreciate that feeling of when something's built. Like, imagine being on that team and you were designing this project and then you actually saw it come to life. You'd think you're the coolest person. And it's pretty complex. But yeah, also, I don't know, this kind of maybe idea of it feeling like some scars across the landscape or some sort of permanent damage. And what is it really protecting us from? So it's an engineering masterpiece, but maybe, I don't know, arguably just protecting us from some traffic jams in the future, or maybe traffic jams at even just certain times of day. It does, for some reason, scream inefficiency, like maybe he captured this moment of day when just no one was on it, but it seems so underutilised. And it makes me think, how often in other aspects of the engineering world do we over-engineer? Do we create things unnecessarily beyond what we actually need? And if we are over-engineering, why are we over-engineering? Can engineers and architects alike do a better job of questioning, why do we need this? Do we need to be building more? Do we need to be expanding? And it sometimes feels like, as engineers, we're actually enabling growth and expansion rather than challenging it, which is a little bit scary. And rather than challenging the cause of the problem, exactly what you were referring to before with the truck, how do we get the truck off the road? Would we avoid building things if the users understood more? It seems odd that we accept certain behaviours and are happy to pay extraordinary amounts for it. I sometimes think with water, for example, if we actually had better demand management, we may not need to build new water treatment plants or build whatever it might be. But is it because behaviour management and demand management is scary and actually really hard? Another thing that comes to mind here is, are we trying to optimise the suboptimal? Are we just trying to make something less bad? I don't know. And also, I guess one final point, can we find that balance of improving our everyday aspects of life and making life more comfortable for everyone, meet our needs, maybe rather than exceed them, while regenerating our planet and improving ecological outcomes and environmental outcomes? What is that balance? How can we use this infrastructure to actually make this place better and maybe bring wildlife back into it, as we have seen with the Spaghetti Junction being a pretty fantastic ecological corridor for native birds, apparently.
Thank you, Caroline. Charles Walker.
Kia ora tātou. Ki te rana aho, ko McDonald Mr. Toka iwi, ko oko te mauna, ko whiriti awa, ko Charles Walker tōku rewa. Good evening, thanks for coming. I'm enormously privileged to be able to work at AUT, where they've allowed me to, not by myself, but work with others to set up a whole new school that Simon alluded to earlier, the School of Future Environments, which turns out to be very timely post-COVID. The te reo name that was gifted to the new School of Future Environments is Huri Te Ao, which means change the world. So nothing if not ambitious. And so perhaps predictably for an architect, I chose images of buildings, but when I saw these in the exhibition, I was intrigued because I've been reading at the same time a book by a guy called Felipe Fernandez Ernesto, who wrote a book called Out of Our Minds. And the book is really about the imagination and what makes us human and what makes us think about where we are, how to be in the world. And he talks about how imagination emerges from the space between memory and anticipation. So what we remember, or more likely what we forget and what we fill in, and what we anticipate might happen in the future is the space of imagination. And so I was intrigued by these images of pretty well-known architectural monuments in various cities around the world. There are 4 in this. I thought it was just one slide, there was 4. By a Swiss painter called Irini Kung. Now, these are photographs, but they're heavily manipulated post-production. So they're photographs of very well-known monuments that are taken from positions that you wouldn't normally be able to see them from. And they look like they're nighttime shots, but they're not. They're daytime shots that have been manipulated in the studio. There are no people. There's no light. There's stillness. The light is flat. And so she begins to talk about how we dream about cities, how we imagine the kind of places that we might occupy or live in or visit. And she's done these for cities all around the world. I thought they were incredible. And I'm kind of interested also in, she's also been influenced by a book by Italo Calvino, which is pretty well known, Invisible Cities, which talks about how people imagine places. Invisible Cities is about a story, you probably know this, but Marco Polo, the explorer, goes to China and talks to Kubla Khan about all the great cities he's seen on his travels, and Khan is entranced by these stories and these descriptions. And it turns out that Polo is really just talking about Venice, his own city, and he tells 55 different versions of Venice. And so this is kind of, different versions of the same human longing, perhaps. And so I began to think about, what would be Auckland? How could we imagine Auckland? I mean, Sky Tower, obviously. But how do we think about how will we live here? How will we live differently in the future? If we move to the next slide, this is a Torre Velasca in Milan, but actually the previous one, and the Arc de la Défense in Paris, which are really kind of, again, monuments. I'll talk about monuments. This is an axis with the Arc de Triomphe on the right, and this is opposite the Duomo in Milan, so it's a kind of neo-Gothic thing built designed in 1958. This is a Fragility building in New York that you would never really see like that, but astonishing, and the Gherkin in London by Norman Foster. And so in different ways, these buildings begin to define their cities or their neighbourhoods. And as architects go and travel and look at buildings, but we can't do that anymore. So I was kind of interested in how we begin to think about what COVID has meant, how we look at these places anew, empty of people and so on. And then I started to think about if COVID is a kind of a difficult experience for us, imagine what climate change might be. So COVID's like a kind of dry run for the kind of problems we're going to experience in climate change and how we understand our environments. And I guess I thought that talk was going to be funnier. Black and white images of desperate, starving people. But I think, what we've seen with COVID and we've seen in the world over the last few years is how people are becoming less kind. Outside New Zealand, people are becoming less kind. If you think of what the world might be, if you think about the politics of climate change, think about how the world treats desperate, fleeing people, migrants who are seeking for a better life, and how that relates to the previous images where people are removed from the image because they're troublesome and aesthetic in some way. How do we how do we treat each other? And again, this book, Out of Our Minds, talks about the imagination, which includes empathy, the ability to understand and anticipate the needs and desires of others. I think it's a really interesting juxtaposition for the exhibition for me. It raised a whole lot of questions about how we live. The exhibition used to be called, I think the previous title was Civilisation, How We Live Now, but we changed that to Photography Now, because we don't live like this anymore because we're post-COVID. But, I think that the kind of common humanity that's expressed in this picture. So these are migrants fleeing from Africa towards Italy, and they're in one rubber dinghy floating in the middle of the Mediterranean. And they're picked up by an Italian Coast Guard vessel. And so one of the things that has struck me during the COVID times is that we in New Zealand are isolated little kind bubble. And we know that things are not so great in lots of other countries. But we're somehow isolated. We don't have the problems of mass migration. We don't have boat people coming to our shores because it's assumed that it's too far away. The Australians showed how they deal with these people a few years ago. What would we do? We have the luxury of not being part of a global system. We sell them our butter and mutton and lamb or whatever we sell them. But we're also separate from them. And so we're part of these kind of international, global, kind of monumental systems. But we're also part of this kind of other common humanity. And so if people show up in dinghies off the shores of New Zealand, what do we do? How kind will we be? And I thought, that's kind of depressing, isn't it? I thought, I did think it was going to be funny, and it was going to be funnier yesterday, but today I don't. Anyway, so I'm going to stop there before it gets really depressing. But I still think it's interesting.
Thank you, Carol. Caroline, I wonder if I could pick up on something you said. You were talking about the motorways, and that image is both beautiful and ugly. And the ugliness comes from what we know it is, and the beauty comes from what it looks like, the aesthetic of it, I guess. I've always thought that was true about the Waterview interchange here, that you look at that, it's an extraordinary piece of engineering and civic design. And my thought is always, it's amazing, and why is it that best of humanity, that skill and creativity that went into that, why is it that we put it into motorways and find it so hard to put it into other things? Or do we? Do you have a comment on that?
Sure. I don't know if I've been around long enough to know exactly the answer to that. But from what I understand is that, I don't know, is it, or maybe the question is it because of this desire to be independent and to have our own vehicle, and maybe that's almost a measure of feeling, I don't know, successful, being able to get from A to B without having to actually interact with the collective society? Like, is that how we define being successful or affluent, or whatever it might be? And do we just kind of, is it because we don't exactly have the right target audience? Maybe we're listening too much to those people when we're designing around them rather than designing for the majority. I don't know.
Either of the other two?
I think that infrastructure is almost always beautiful, because it's really about how do you design things that are kind of efficient in every sense. They're functionally efficient, they use material in an efficient way. So you think about Roman aqueducts, they're usually pretty beautiful. You think about kind of railway bridges.
Would you rush to say that about the port, say?
Ports have their own
They can do, but
beauty. A Dutch architect, Rem Koolhaas, talked about what he called the terrifying beauty of the 20th century, and how the things that kind of emerged in the 20th century in terms of scale and technology were kind of terrifying and beautiful and awesome in every sense. So I can see that.
tease that out a little more. So you may know that there was a big dispute in the last couple of years about the Chamberlain Park golf course, which is on the other side of the motorway and Great North Road from Western Springs Park, the people who wanted to save the golf course put up a proposal that suggested there be a green bridge built over the motorway, over the road, that would connect Western Springs to Chamberlain Park. And the main purpose of the bridge would be to provide a walkway for animal life, for wild animals, because we have a lot. But anyway, for that. But also it would help with the bird life, because it's a bird right the way from the coast inland. There's a trail there for birds. So the question there is, that's an opportunity, because people would use that all the time. It would be fantastic, you know, people would use it to picnic on and play on and walk on and ride bikes on and all the rest. There's an opportunity to do something that you can see the potential. You can see the potential for enrichment, environmental values, all the rest of it. And yet it's the kind of thing that just doesn't happen. It's impossible to think that will ever happen, really, I think. But it's a fantastic idea, isn't it? Or am I wrong? Maybe it can happen. Tim?
Well, it certainly does happen in lots of places, that sort of stuff, dealing with the barriers that we've created for lots of our systems. That, it does happen. There are animal bridges and sort of all sorts of clever stuff that goes on with roads and infrastructure elsewhere. I guess it's at the heart of that tension that I was sort of commenting on there. The man-made artifice of the city is not nature in lots of ways, isn't it? It might have things that we reflect with, but we're almost inherently tripping over, are we trying to submit nature, are we trying to take control and sort of be dominant and set our systems in place, or are we actually allowing it in a really controlled way, like those super trees? It's kind of almost a tokenism, and what is real nature? Is it systemic, or is it just something that we put in a box and show off every now and again? I certainly think there's an enormous amount that we push forward in that space. We're doing parts of it in Auckland much better now than we have done. Just looking after rainwater because we treasure our harbour more, and all those sorts of things, doing Key Street up with trees and planting and all the things that actually bring a bit of our coastal character back. That is important,
And part of the problem with those sorts of things is the way we talk about them, isn't it? Yeah. If you think about Karama Happy Road, or you think about Key Street and the work that's being done there, the money is going into what's underground.
Yes, right.
And those trees that are being planted there are terrific sinkholes for stormwater.
Mm-hmm.
But actually we debate it in terms of road cones and cycle lanes,
That's right.
Which is really just the last thing that gets laid on top.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem we have.
It is.
Yeah. Charles?
Well, I think we have to ask, what does Auckland want to be, or what do we want Auckland to be? And if you think about the geology and the topography of Auckland, it could be something sensational. Well, back in the day, in the 1970s, a professor of architecture at the University of Auckland wrote a great paper, a kind of polemic, around Auckland as the water city of the South Pacific, and he had this idea that you could build buildings that kind of related to the volcanic cones and the valleys, and he talked about how the real public space of a city like Auckland wasn't a piazza or a square or something like that had been imported from Europe. It was actually a bay. That's where people gather. They gather with their back to the land, looking out to the sea, and the idea of kind of refuge and prospect and engaging with the ocean was the real public space. You can see it in Mission Bay, and those people go there, and skate around and run around, and that's interesting. And he had to propose, but he reinstated the kind of Maori waterways and jetties, so that people could have visions of kind of vaporettos and things crossing the harbour. And it was a compelling vision, but at that time, people saw that as kind of romantic, dreamy, kind of regional stuff, and we should be thinking more internationally. And so it wasn't really seen as relevant. Whereas now we are starting again to think about, well, what are we here? What can we do here that is unique and culturally and socially and kind of geographically and environmentally relevant?
Any more thoughts on why we're not moving faster on that?
We haven't had the School of Future environments.
Well, we'll give you a year.
My response would be there's actually a lot of depth in that. So that was really interesting, Charles, the example you gave there. which is the first time I've heard that particular story, shows my ignorance. But I think what's really interesting in the example you gave is there's kind of a spatial structure thing. It's not superficial, is it? It's not a, you know, there's been a stage where to sort of do culturally relevant design was about patterns and imageries and motifs, and that was fine. And particularly if it's endorsed by people who want to see that, that's perfectly fine. But there's a depth to spatial and community and social networks which comes through in, it's a bay, it's not a piazza, it's not that piazza or bay should be this colour or that pattern. It's about there's a fundamental kind of social construct there which is really important to people, and that's much richer. And I think that journey we're going on with cultural design is taking the next step beyond the superficial into what is really in culture.
Those could be seen as local variants of a kind of global condition. I mean, I think we're all human, and I'm interested in, I mean, the guy who wrote that Water City studied under, he studied Patrick Geddes, and he worked at, Patrick Geddes was a kind of early 20th century polymath, a biologist, time planner, sociologist, whatever. And he coined that phrase, act local, think global. And he talked about how people could operate at different scales, and they could connect to their culture and their local environment, but they could also be aware of, you know, so he talked, you know, and it reminded me of Bruno Latour, the philosopher who wrote about how we can't think aware of the climate emergency by being purely indigenous and regional. We have to recognise that it is a global problem, and globalisation is now a bit uncool, it's a bit unfashionable, or politically loaded, but actually it's a global issue that we need to think about collectively.
Karen?
Sure, I mean, you've kind of got to it towards the end, but definitely in the New Zealand context, how can we more and more champion the voices of those who understand the country the best in the context, and I don't know, around decolonising, also a very loaded word, but is that kind of, maybe is that the future of our city or New Zealand really valuing the Te Ao Māori worldview?
Just a few other images here. This one, is this anybody's, is this the office you work in, Tim?
Brings back flashbacks, yes, certainly. Feels more like student days than anything else. But
So Charles, you're...
Yeah, well, I actually thought of choosing this because at the beginning of the year, when we opened our new architecture programme, we expected 50 or 60 students. We took 110 into the same size space, and that was just before COVID hit. So we were trying to socially distance in 100 people in a space built for 60. My vice chancellor's here, so I'll just remind you that we need more space. But so the plan is, and we did have the IVs as well. They were useful.
One of the things I really like about this image is that I'm completely confounded about how to feel about it. It's terribly creative and exciting. There's something rather frightening about the uniforms they're wearing, which have a kind of concentration camp elements to them. And I'm sure that's not accidental. Nobody looks happy. But then they do most of them look absorbed too, so, you know, that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is work in the modern world, is it? It might be something fantastic, but actually it's possibly just a whole lot more stuff.
When I started architecture school back in the 17th century, when it was 1976, I think, all the problems were about what should we do with all the leisure time we have in the year 2000.
Yeah,
but we don't have to work.
This is something you're going to build for us, Caroline. Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell us about this.
So this is a sewer in Tokyo, a design for a massive stormwater event. Yeah, I guess it kind of...
Every city should have one.
Yeah,
especially this one.
Yes, I mean, maybe. I think it speaks to a lot of the daily job that engineers have to make decisions around risk versus resilience. Like, what event do we design for? Do we design for the 1 in 1,000 year event, or do we design for the 1 in 10 year event? And those events are becoming more and more frequent. Like up in Northland just last month, we had the 1 in 100 year event a couple of times or something just bizarre like that. So yeah, it's
So,
very complex.
My suggestion actually is to really go ahead and build it, turn it into a theatre or a restaurant, or
Yes.
use it for pop-up, all sorts of activities.
Circus.
Charge people to go down there, because who wouldn't pay to go and see it? Yeah, and then just clear it out when the storm comes. You know. It's going to work.
I like it.
This image here, Brooks Brothers, the ordinariness of life, the shirts, Brooks Brothers, all the same shirts, and outside the window, that's the ruins of 9/11. It's an image for our times, isn't it? It's just the world we live in. Yeah. I wanted to ask you whether you feel beauty can be frightening, and if beauty can be frightening, does that have implications for the built environment? Yeah, the desire to build beautiful buildings. Yeah, are there scary things involved in that?
Absolutely, I think they are. And I think for me, one of the scariest things is that there's a side comment really, that there's an obsession with aesthetics and design these days. I think when you use the word design, a lot of people simply think it's about a product sale of a high-end object. And that deeply worries me as a designer who thinks design has actually got a lot to do with society and problem solving and complex cultural questions, but we've reduced it to this thing of how can I get maximum value from this shiny product, and how can I get a $2 million apartment. Yes, it is quite terrifying in some ways, the part of the exhibition this is in has got some quite interesting pieces around it. We're doing things to people here, aren't we? Which in a way we're when you look at the other photos around it, we're doing to food and design of things that we want to consume in bizarre ways. So yeah, it's quite terrifying.
And yet we want wonderful buildings. We're sitting in one of Auckland's best buildings right now, and
Yes.
part of what's great is its mix of the old and the new.
That's right.
It's thrilling always to come here. And we want more of them, don't we, Charles?
Yeah, sure. I think, the other thing about the civilization of monuments, I'm quite interested in cities as, there's obviously discussion around what are cities are for people, yes, but actually traditionally they're not. Cities are for institutions and monuments, and there's, they have their place. So beautiful buildings have their place as one of the kind of iconic building has its place, but I'm much more interested also in how the kind of general texture of a city kind of emerging. So what are the neighbourhoods like? What are the kind of small-scale spaces where people kind of live and work and play like at a kind of human level? Because the meaning of the monuments changes over time. A mosque or a church can become a nightclub or whatever, but it still has a kind of presence in the memory. And again, those images are kind of surreal, kind of hyper-real memories.
I've always thought that one of the really challenging buildings in this country in relation to that idea of what we need from our buildings is, I'm sorry to say, Jazz Max's Te Papa. Te Papa is not a great success aesthetically, just speaking personally. I know I'm not the only one. But Te Papa, when it opened, broke all records for museum attendance in this country, has remained one of the most popular public buildings in the country at a colossal scale. It is amazingly successful as a public building serving the public. You cannot argue that the architecture made that happen. I can't see how you would do that, but nor can you argue that the architecture got in the way of that happening. It's perhaps a humbling experience for architects.
I think
What's the lesson there? Most
buildings of that scale are probably not universally popular. I think if you ask the public to vote on that, they would say it was horrible, but they do embed themselves into the life of the city. So you think of the Sky Tower 20 years ago, because but the Sky Tower is an iconic image of Auckland. The people, even if you don't like it, when you drive back from Northland across the bridge, you see Sky Tower, it's like, come home, or and you wonder what colour lights they're going to have that day, or whatever. And I can't say I like it, but it's something that represents Auckland, or arriving somehow in Auckland. My 2-year-old every time goes, Sky Tower. you know, but you see it anywhere.
So what does that mean? That the thing is to make sure we have those buildings because they do those things, but also not to define the city by them because that having that marae that is the bay, having those things that are organic to us, they're where we are and they're really important too.
I think the thing is to connect them into a kind of wider fabric or network. You know, I think that Eiffel Tower was a monstrosity, an eyesore, but now it's a kind of a tourist icon. But I think also the idea of kind of design being aesthetics is that we've separated the design disciplines from the kind of technical disciplines, from the kind of social ones, and so we don't make the connections perhaps that we need to do.
I love this image. This is Mardi Gras, crowd for a Mardi Gras parade in New Orleans. And you can see how people have decorated themselves with the necklaces, and there's a great sense of, you see the people up on the top row there, they've come out, they're going to do a show when the parade goes past, you just kind of feel that. I feel that. There's so much going on in there, the life of it, the celebration of an historical event. This is us, this is them celebrating themselves. And there's another version of it, which is another crowd looking for at the same parade. They're a different colour, they don't have as many beads, and they're as excited too, I think. But each to their own, you know.
They're a lot tidier.
Yeah, they're a lot tidier. Well, yes, they are. They're a lot tidier. Different. We're nearing the end of the session, but we do have time for questions if somebody would like to ask a question. I think there might be a microphone that gets brought to you because we're recording this, so it'd be great to get that on any question recorded. Is there anyone who'd like to ask any of our panellists something about one of their images or any of the other images in the show that you've seen and excite you or trouble you or confuse you or profoundly reinforce something you believe or whatever?
Flick through to the question one.
Flick through
Keep going. One more.
to there.
Back. Yeah. Just in case this is stuck.
Okay. Does anybody have a question?
An observation in that in this city we're talking about buildings of significance, Sky Tower, things like that. But what we're tending to forget or have forgotten is the inherent structures that we have within the cityscape itself, with our volcanoes, that lots of people have been quite intent on destroying our view paths over a period of time. And it's that kind of thing, I think, that we need to come back to when you're all talking about, what do we do? How do we signify our city? We create bays and things like that. We have a huge opportunity to do more with those, and instead, of course, what we're doing is building motorways and things like that all around them to stop us seeing them and from stopping. Sorry, that's not a question, that's an observation. I pointed that out, my wife.
Well, I think if you get your hand on Richard Toy's Water City of the South Pacific,
Right.
he deals with those issues. He deals with the kind of the environmental topographies of Auckland and how we could respond to them in a better way. But he was working at a time when people were trying to be very international here and build
Yes.
kind of
Yeah.
European cities.
Yeah. As we're nearing the end, I wonder if I could ask each of you, in relation to the city, and I mentioned in my introduction the whole concept of building back better, and that we know we can do it, but we also fear we may not do it. I think Auckland is a city of enormous opportunity. Part of a country that's been so much less affected by COVID, and that will probably remain true for years. A city where we're big enough for a critical mass of all sorts of things to happen, but also small enough to get things done, to make things happen, because people know each other, and nobody's that far away from the power or the money or whatever, and the systems are democratic and robust and pretty flexible. And yet, as Charles said, COVID was a dress rehearsal for the climate crisis. I think we all know that. on the balance of optimism and pessimism, where do you sit and why?
I think as an educator and a designer, I have to be optimistic. You know, like my job, I get 100 young, bright-eyed people coming in every year wanting to make the world a better place. And so we have to be optimistic. And so I am, even though my slides weren't very optimistic. I quite like Gramsci's quote. He talked about pessimism of the intellect, because you know that things could be bad, but optimism of the will. And you have to find the balance between those things to kind of keep you going. You can be critical and whatever. As an academic, I have to be super critical of everything I see, but I'm still quite an optimistic person. I have to carry the world lightly. And I think that New Zealand could, you know, I think it is an optimistic country. You know, it's got a lot going for it, and it's kind. Which how long can we stay kind? I think when you know things start to get rough, can we keep that goodness?
Tim?
Look, I'd second that, and I don't know whether it's a shared heritage of sort of coming from the other side of the world, but it's incredibly refreshing to arrive in Auckland as somebody who's grown up in different places, because there is this optimism and can do. And I know that to some degree is easy to hear and maybe something that we hear ourselves a lot, but I think we shouldn't undervalue that. I think there is absolutely something very special in Kiwi culture. And I think the other side to it is, you know, imagination can actually take us a long way, and I think some of the things that we're probably lacking in this world is imagination, giving ourselves the ability and the license to actually believe that we could do something better. Because if we just sit back and accept it, we're not going to get anything, clearly, are we? And I think that's actually, there's huge optimism in this country around those values and those opportunities.
Cool. So personally, I feel optimistic. I've been through a few waves, I think, already of optimism and pessimism around climate change specifically, but definitely back on the rise in terms of optimism. I think also just knowing that being part of that generation that needs to have hope, it's actually really our only choice. Yeah, but that's okay. I think one thing that's probably going to not destroy our generation's hope, but is, I don't know if any of you have seen The Social Dilemma. We are far too absorbed in those coming younger than us by social media, and it's not leaving enough space in our brains to actually care about social and global environmental issues, personally. So I feel like we're at a real crunch point now to actually, I don't know, it's a massive problem, but how do we actually promote creativity within our young people to keep them engaged and keep them interested, because we're the only ones who can really do it.
Thank you. Just wanted to end on this image. There's people on escalators. The thing that I love about this image is that they all know something big is going to happen. That's the way I read it. It may not be true, it's looking into the mall maybe, but I think they all know something's going to happen. Even the baby knows. Charles Walker, Caroline Hope and Tim Robinson, thank you very much.